Welcome to Torah Today Ministries and our continuing series called Parshah Seasonings. In this series, as you probably know by now, we look into some of the details of the Hebrew language that lies behind our English translations of the Torah. We also look into details that reveal themselves only in the Torah scroll. But in this Torah portion Bow, which is found in Exodus chapter 10, verse 1 through 13:16, there aren't really any anomalies in the Torah scroll, so we're being looking strictly at some of the wording, the Hebrew words used in this portion. And there's some amazing things here, and I hope you will enjoy this teaching as much as I enjoyed preparing it. So let's start right in with the name of our portion, which is Bow. It comes from the first verse of chapter 10. It says, "Then Adonai said to Moses, 'Go to Pharaoh.'" So Bow means go. At least that's what our translators tell us. And it can mean go. Bow can mean, and here's the word, is beit, aleph. It can mean either go or come. Go or come. But most of the time, bow means come, not go. If you want to tell someone to go, you say lech, which comes from the verb halak, to walk, to go. And almost all the time you see bow, it means to come. But I guess that sounded odd to the translators, because why would God tell Moses, "Come to Pharaoh, I'm over here with Pharaoh, come join us"? That sounds a little weird. So it's a difficult thing to picture. But let's really think about this. It's almost as if God is saying, "Moses, I'm here with my people in Egypt. I'm here and I'm setting up this Pharaoh as a foil to display my wonders and my love for my people and my strength and the fact that I'm the only God. There are no other gods. I've got everything set. The stage is set. The only thing missing is you. So come to Pharaoh, because I'm here and I want to get this thing started." So I think come is definitely a better translation. Now, an interesting thing about this word bow is that if you reverse the order of the letters and spell it aleph beit, it becomes the word av, father. And when I read through the Hebrew scriptures and I come to this word bow, come, I always think every time I follow God's instructions to come or go, I'm actually drawing closer to the Father. Because the way we draw close to God is by aligning our behavior with His and doing the commandments He gives us to do. Now, as we continue on, we're going to spend pretty much the rest of this teaching in chapter 12, which describes the Passover lamb and this setting up this lamb whose blood brought passage from deliverance from death to life, and whose body brought deliverance from slavery to freedom. This is an amazing chapter about Passover. So we're going to look at verse 3. "And God tells Moses, 'Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's households, a lamb for each household.'" Now, the phrase congregation of is one word in Hebrew, and it's the word Adat. Adat. Now, Adat isn't congregation, it's congregation of. And when you spell it just congregation, it looks like this. Ayin Dalet Hey. But that hey drops off when you make it congregation of, and it's replaced with a tav, Adat, which is more technical language than you probably need to get through this teaching. But I just want to make sure people aren't emailing me saying, "Oh, you misspelled the word for congregation." Now, the word Adat comes from the first two letters, aid, which means testimony or witness. Now, I'm pointing this out because there are two words in Hebrew that people tend to think are used interchangeably when really they're not. Though they can both be translated as an assembly or a congregation, they have slightly different shadings of meaning. Now, the one word is the word kahal. That's the word on the left you can see on the screen. And I talk in detail about this word kahal in my series called Pardon My Jargon. I did 2 episodes about the word church, and I encourage you to listen to those, because this word kahal means exactly the same thing as the Greek word ekklesia, which is generally translated church. They're exactly the same thing. It means a group of people who are called together for a particular purpose. And the reason we don't find the word church in the Hebrew scriptures, and the translations that is because King James established a precedent that the word church would only appear in the New Testament scriptures. He did not want it to appear anywhere in the Old Testament scriptures, because he wanted to make this wall where the church is something completely different and distinct from the Jewish people. But anyone who's read the book of Romans knows that we as Gentiles are grafted into Israel. We're not something separate from Israel. So anyways, we've grown up in a world where church only applies to the New Testament scriptures, but never to the Old Testament scriptures. But the word kahal is exactly the same word. So what is the difference between kahal and Adat? It's this. Kahal has to do with being called together around a common purpose. You can think of it this way. Kahal, think of a magnet, which is pulling people towards something, and that something is God and His Word. But Adah is outward focused. Think of it like a flashlight. It's witnessing, it's taking what it is focused on and taking it to the world, because it's the witness and the testimony of the kahal. So when you see these 2 words, if you read Hebrew, you see kahal, you see Adah, and that should be a letter H there, not a T. You'll know what the slight difference is between the 2. It's a very subtle difference, but it's still there. Well, moving on. We come to verse 6, and God is describing this lamb that he just spoke of. And he says, on the 10th day, you take the lamb out from the flock. And it says in verse 6, and you shall keep it until the 14th day. So for 4 days, you watch this lamb. I find it interesting that Yeshua rode into Jerusalem on the 10th of the month, and he was examined for 4 days in the temple. Then on the 14th of the month is when he was crucified. So you keep it to the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. That word twilight is actually a phrase. Most of the time we have one Hebrew word replacing several English words, but here we have 2 Hebrew words replacing 1 English word. In Hebrew, twilight is Bein ha'aravim. Bein ha'aravim. Bein means between. Between what? The Erevs. Erev is evening. Aravim is evenings. Ha'aravim means the evenings. Bein ha'aravim. Between the evenings. Now, what in the world does between the evenings mean? And I'll tell you what the sages say. We really don't know. Oh, they guess and they have opinions, but honestly, they really don't know. It's a very odd figure of speech. But the one profound thing they do say, and it's a bit mystical, they say it's an indeterminate time. It's an indeterminate time. It's a point in time you just can't quite put your finger on. We do know it's around twilight. We understand physically that's what they're referring to, but why this choice of words, Bein ha'aravim? But when you think about Yeshua's crucifixion, and it took place Bein ha'aravim, it was a timeless event, wasn't it? Because the scriptures tell us that he was crucified from the foundation of the world. That doesn't mean he was nailed to the cross somehow before God began creating the earth. But what it does mean is that the reality, the certainty of his crucifixion, his death for mankind, was already engraved in stone. It was unchangeable. It was going to happen. It was so certain, it was almost as if it had already happened. Historically, we know when it happened. But in the larger scope of things, what we see happening historically 2,000 years ago was something that affected all of mankind before, during, and after. It's a timeless event. It's an indeterminate time. It's Bein Ha'aravim, between the evenings, whatever that means. Now, this phrase, Bein Ha'aravim, is found exactly 11 times in the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Scriptures, exactly 11. And I put the references to the different ways it's used. For example, in Scripture, we're commanded, or the Israelites are commanded to sacrifice a lamb in the morning and a lamb in the evening. So the sacrificial day in the tabernacle and the temple was bookended by this morning lamb and this evening lamb that were sacrificed. They're called the Tamid offerings. And the Tamid, the evening Tamid, always took place Bein Ha'aravim. When God sent the quail to feed the people later on, we'll read about this, it occurred Bein Ha'aravim. And then the high priest is told, or one of the priests, to go in and to kindle the menorah, and he was to do that Bein Ha'aravim. So we find different applications of this phrase. But what's interesting is how and where they occur. Here you see I put the 5 books of the Torah because all 11 occurrences of this phrase occur only in the Torah. So I have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and this phrase occurs 0 times in Genesis and 0 times in Deuteronomy. But it occurs 5 times here in Exodus and another 5 times over in Numbers. But in the middle book of the Torah, it occurs only 1 time. Now you can see that what I've done here is made a menorah pattern, and please excuse my very subpar sketching, but you can see this forms a menorah pattern. And when there's a menorah pattern, just like with any menorah, like the one over my right shoulder, there's a center stalk which holds everything together. So with these 11 occurrences, what's the center one? What's the one that ties them all together? Well, the passage in Leviticus is found in chapter 23 and verse 5. And it says this: in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, Bein Ha'aravim, is Adonai's Passover. It's almost as if God is saying everything centers around this timeless event, the Passover, when the Passover lamb would be slaughtered. And its blood would provide deliverance from death to life. Its body would provide deliverance from slavery to freedom. It's an amazing thing. And of course, it's a picture of Yeshua's sacrifice, which happened on the evening of Passover, Bein Ha'aravim. Well, we have to move on. As we come down to verse 13, and it's continuing to discuss the Passover lamb. It's talking about the blood. You collect the blood of this lamb when you slay it, and it says, and the blood shall be for a sign for you in the houses where you live. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. We have to understand that though Israel was protected from most of the plagues, it was not protected from the 10th plague, this last plague, the death of the firstborn. This plague affected everybody, unless you took particular steps. Just being Jewish wasn't good enough. But this one, you could escape its consequences, the death of your firstborn child, by taking the blood of this Passover lamb and putting it on the doorposts, the mezuzot, and across the lintel of your door. And when God says, when I see the blood, it says, we'll come knock on the door and investigate and interrogate who's inside. I see the sign on the door, I'm good. I pass over that house. No death comes there. I have to believe that it wasn't just the children of Israel who put blood of a lamb on their doors. I believe that the people who came out with them, this great mixed multitude that came out the next morning with the Israelites, did the same thing. I believe that by this point in the story of the plagues, anyone who had ears to hear and eyes to see knew that the gods of Egypt were losers. They were nothing. They were non-existent. But the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the Israelites, was the only true God. And so when the warning went out that all the firstborn of Egypt are going to die, unless you do this one thing, I think a lot of those Gentile slaves, a lot of the Egyptians, they thought, I'm not taking any chances on this. And they put the blood on their doors. And the only thing I can find supporting this, other than the fact that says a great mixed multitude went out with them next morning, is that if you had just lost your firstborn, the next morning you'd be in such grief, such mourning. I don't think you'd be thinking about walking out of Egypt. I think those people who left Egypt with the Jewish people went out because they were rejoicing. And they weren't mourning the deaths of their firstborn. But it's my opinion, my thought. You can take it or leave it. I won't get angry if you disagree. That's fine. Anyways, let's get back to our passage. It says it shall be for a sign. 3 words in English, but only one in Hebrew. La'ot. La'ot. Now, the lamed at the front of this is a prefix that is a preposition. And when a lamed is attached to the front of a word, it means to or toward or for. So the word that it's attached to is the word ot. Now, oftentimes when we attach or prefix a letter to a word, a letter drops out of the middle of the word. Because normally in this word ot, it's spelled like this. There's a letter vav in the middle. It's spelled aleph, vav, tav. So this is the full spelling. So like I said, when you attach the lamed to the front, the vav goes away. Just one of those things about Hebrew. So I want us to look at the word itself, the word ot, which means sign. What's interesting is this word ot is also the Hebrew word for a letter, like A, B, C, D, E. Not a letter you write, but a letter of the alphabet. And coincidentally, this word ot occurs exactly 22 times in the Hebrew Scriptures. And how many Hebrew letters are there? 22. Maybe not a coincidence after all. You can also read these letters as aleph and tav, because there is no Hebrew word for and. The letter vav, this middle letter, is prefixed to a word to mean and. So we can take a few liberties and say aleph and tav. Aleph and tav are the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet, like alpha and omega in the Greek alphabet. So this will be for a sign, an ot. So when they put the blood on their doorposts and lintels, it would have made a shape like this. Up one doorpost, across the lintel, down the other one, like goalpost. Now there are 3 Hebrew letters that you see here that have that same basic shape. And since this sign, this ot, this word is also the word for a letter, let's look at this in kind of a fanciful way and pretend they're actually putting a Hebrew letter here. So which letter is it? Could it be the letter Hey, the 5th letter of the alphabet? The letter just simply sounds like the letter H, just like an outbreathing of breath. Could this letter on their doors represent breath, the breath of God? Or could it represent the 8th letter of the alphabet, the letter Chet, the letter that represents life? Chai is living. Chaim is life. L'chaim, to life. And this letter is always a symbol for life. Now you can see the only difference between this letter and the Hey is that Hey has a little break right here in the upper left-hand corner, and Chet is connected all the way around. Or could this symbol on their doorpost and lintels be the letter Tav, which goes up, across, and down, then has a little foot on the left-hand side? And that letter means cross. The name of the letter Tav, Tav means cross. Or could it represent all 3? Could it be that this sign, this ot that they put on their doors, represent the fact that the people inside still have breath, and that God's breath is going to enter in and fill them with joy when the rest of Israel is grieving. And the reason they're filled with joy is because God has given them chaim, life, and that life has come through the cross upon which the Passover lamb who takes away the sins of the world would be crucified on this day, but a couple thousand years in the future. Or about 1,500 years, I guess. I think we just can't quite ignore these letters. We have to read something into this. Some may argue, well, this form of the Hebrew letters didn't exist at the time of Moses. Well, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But God is God. He's timeless. He knows the end from the beginning. He dwells throughout time. Time dwells within him. And he could even prefigure the use of these particular types of Hebrew letters that were to be used later on. He saw it all. So time is never an obstacle to God's sovereignty and his will. But it's something to think about. And I invite you to meditate on these. And whenever you read this story, think of breath, think of life, and think of the cross. As we go a little bit further in our chapter, we come to verses 40 and 41. Now, this gets a little bit away from what I normally discuss in the Parshah Seasoning episodes, but I've just decided I would include this because there's a lot of confusion and questions about the timing of the years that Israel actually spent in Egypt. In one place in scriptures, it indicates 400 years. Another place, it indicates 430 years. And yet historically, we know that it was only about 270 years that they spent actually in Egypt, because you could do the calculations as you figure it out. This can be very confusing. Is it 430? Is it 400? Is it 270? Oy vey, what's going on? So let's see if we can break this down, make some sense of it. In verses 40 and 41, this is what it says. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. Now, let's stop there for a second. That may sound pretty straightforward in English, but look at how it's worded. This is literally how it's worded in Hebrew. 30 years and 400 years. At the end of 430 years, and again, it uses the same phrase, 30 years and 400 years, and that's just the way it's done in this particular Hebrew passage. On that very day, 430 years from what day? What happened on this day of Passover 430 years later that Moses is referring to? But anyways, whatever that day was, 430 years later, all the host of Adonai went out from the land of Egypt. So, what's going on here? So we have two questions. First, what happened 430 years earlier? And second, why does this conflict with what God told Abram back in Genesis 15, where he talks about 400 years instead of 430? So let's work through this passage in Genesis 15. Now, Genesis 15 is the chapter that describes the covenant between the parts, where God told Abram to take certain animals, cut them in half, lay the halves side by side, and there would be a bloody path in between. And God put Abram into a deep sleep, but in his sleep, Abraham saw God passing between the parts in the form of a flaming torch and a smoking furnace, and God speaks to him. And God establishes a blood covenant with a human being, which is mind-boggling. But that all occurs in Genesis 15. Now, this is what God speaks to Abram. Then Adonai said to Abram, know for certain that your seed, now your translation may say children or offspring, but in Hebrew it's the word zara, seed, will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants, and they will be afflicted 400 years. Not 430, 400. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. What are we to make of this? Well, this is how the rabbis traditionally have understood this timing. Exodus 15 is the first box right here, the covenant with Abraham. Abraham was 70 years old, same age as me, when that occurred. 30 years later, when Abraham reached the age of 100, his son Isaac was born. Abraham was 100, and Sarah was 90 years old. That's in Genesis chapter 21. So there's a 30-year gap between the prophecy in Genesis 15 and the birth of Isaac 30 years later in Genesis 21. According to the rabbis, God hit the button on the stopwatch at the birth of Isaac. And exactly 400 years later, the Exodus took place in Exodus chapter 12. So there's a 400-year period from the birth of Isaac to the Exodus, but a 430-year period from the prophecy when it was originally given to Abraham. So God prophesies us 400-year period, but it doesn't begin for another 30 years. That's how the rabbis have traditionally understood this passage. And what's interesting, it's also how Paul seems to understand the passage, because in Galatians 3, verses 16 and 17, this is what Paul says. Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. And this is referring to the Genesis 15 passage we just read. It does not say, and to seeds, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your seed, as we just saw. Now here's the point, who is Messiah? Now here's the point as far as our calculations are involved. This is what I mean. The Torah, which came 430 years afterward, does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void. So the main point here is Paul sees the giving of the Torah occurring 430 years after the prophecy to Abraham in Genesis 15. So the giving of the Torah took place in the same year that the Exodus took place. The people leave Egypt to cross the Red Sea, and after they leave Egypt, it's 7 weeks later, 49 days later, plus one, on the day of Pentecost, or Shavuot, that God speaks from Mount Sinai and gives the Torah. So it took place 430 years after God made the covenant with Abraham. So that's why Paul uses the 430. But if you do the calculations, there's no way in this world that the Israelites were in Egypt for 400 years. 270 is the best calculation. So how in the world can this passage in Genesis 15, which is the key passage to understand this, how could it say they'll be afflicted for 400 years? Well, before I even look at this, let me just share a personal insight with you and a personal caution with you. For hundreds of years, there have been well-meaning and some maybe not so well-meaning commentators on the scriptures who focus on biblical prophecy, end times prophecy. And they look at the many numbers and passages of time that are described in Bible prophecy, and they try to calculate when certain things are going to happen. And pretty much every single time they do this, they turn out being terribly embarrassed because they're just dead wrong. Our batting average of getting Bible prophecy right, particularly when it has to do with timing, is pretty awful. And we can look at this passage to understand why it is so difficult to suss out how the years and the timing works in Scripture, in Bible prophecy in particular. Now, let's make sure we understand this. The Scriptures are always right. They're ironclad. They don't change. They're always precisely exactly right. Unfortunately, our interpretation of the Scriptures, not so much, especially Bible prophecy, end times prophecy, especially when it comes to calculating times. And this is a prime example of that. Because if we go back with the foreknowledge we now have, or I should say the hindsight, looking back to see how things actually played out, we can go back to this passage in Genesis 15 and now understand it in the light of history, in the light of fulfillment of the prophecy. So here's what God said to Abram. Know for certain that your seed, and remember as Paul says, he's referring to one here, but it's also referring to Isaac. Paul's interpolating and say it's referring to Messiah, but it's also referring to Isaac because this was Abraham's only begotten son. Yeah, I know, there was Ishmael, but his name was Abram then. Abraham's only son was Isaac. So, know that your seed will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. So Isaac was a sojourner in a land that was not his. Jacob was a sojourner in a land that was not his. Jacob's 12 sons were sojourners in a land that was not theirs. And then finally, when Jacob was quite old and his sons were grown and he had many grandchildren, then they went to Egypt. But for a long period of time, Abraham's seed, and though it's singular, it's the same as in English. When you say I'm sowing seed, doesn't mean you're sowing one. You could be sowing a bunch of them. It can be plural or just singular. We can see that his children were sojourners in a land not theirs. Now you say, wait a minute, Grant. Well, they were in Canaan. That was a land that God gave them. That's true. But they didn't possess the land until they came out of Egypt, spent 40 years in the wilderness, and crossed the Jordan under Joshua's leadership. Then they went in and took possession of the land. Then it truly became theirs. It's kind of like someone may say, when I die, I'm going to give you such and such. I'm put in my will that this thing I own or this amount of money becomes yours. So it's legal. It's in the will. It's as good as done. But you don't take possession of that item until something happens, till the death of the one who makes the will. So though God had given the land of Canaan to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and his children, they did not take possession of it until they went in under Joshua. So during all that time, they were sojourners in a land that is not theirs. Then he says, and will be servants, and they will be afflicted. They will be servants, and they will be afflicted. And this will also be in a land that's not theirs, but it's a different land. It's the land of Egypt. And it doesn't say for 400 years. It just simply says 400 years. It would almost seem like God's saying from the time you have a seed until the end of this sojourning in foreign land will take 400 years. When we read it that way, it turns out to be exactly right. But who could have foreseen that by just reading the passage by itself? And this is the problem again with end-time prophecy and Bible prophecy. We can never trust our ability to read the passage as God intended it. He hides things in prophecy as well as reveals things in prophecies. So I think what we need to do is take the heart and soul and the spirit of prophecy and take that to heart and learn from it. And when we read biblical prophecy, ask yourself, what do I learn about God and his Messiah through this? What do I learn about him? When you read the book of Revelation, it's called Revelation because right there in the opening words, the revelation of Yeshua HaMashiach. The revelation is about Yeshua. But it's almost like we forget Yeshua. It's like he just plays a part in a Bible prophecy, and he only exists for the sake of making this fascinating prophecy that we get to spend time with our calculators trying to figure out. No, it's all about Yeshua. And when we read prophecy, focus on who God is and what he wants to reveal about himself to us. Put your calculator away. Because when it comes to these calculations, they're understood backward, but hardly ever understood forward. There are exceptions. Daniel understood it forward. He understood the prophecies of Jeremiah and the timing there. But I'm not a Daniel, and I don't know too many Daniels these days who have such a close walk with God, have been tested like Daniel was, who could perfectly understand the timing of things. So, anyways, just a caution. We don't want to be workmen who are ashamed. We want to be those who rightly divide the word. And we need to understand when we're in over our heads. And let's not be presumptuous and get filled with ego and think that we understand things that no one else up until now, until us, has been able to understand. Because the problem is you probably don't understand it either. So let's be humble. Let's look at prophecy to know God better, not to be able to wow our friends with how bright and clever we are. So with that, I wish you shalom, and may God bless.
Thank you for joining us for today's teaching. If the work of Torah Today Ministries has touched your life, please consider making a donation or sponsoring an upcoming video. As a video sponsor, you'll have an exclusive opportunity to memorialize a family member, celebrate a special event, or simply support the ongoing creation of similar content. Your tax-deductible contribution helps ensure that our teachings continue to reach all who are longing for truth. Click the link or visit our website to learn more.
Until next time.